She awoke abruptly one night and knew immediately that something in the room had changed. There was a quality to the darkness that was different from the black of night. It had a thickness to it, as though the air had become slightly more substantial than usual. At the foot of her bed, near the window, the overhanging shadow began to gather itself into the shape of a young man. Welcome to the Night Visitors, where we share purportedly true accounts of interactions with vampires and other supernatural predators. I'm James, a paranormal researcher and lifelong vampire enthusiast, coming to you from Transylvania. The following is a true story with names and identifying details changed to protect the privacy of those involved. I have always been interested in languages, and I speak about 5 at a fairly advanced level and others with lesser degrees of fluency. In the early 2000s, I attended Hebrew language classes at a Jewish community center in Massachusetts, since Jewish folklore and mysticism had long fascinated me, and I figured at least learning to read the alphabet would be a good thing. Unfortunately, I didn't learn much Hebrew, but what I did get, one particular evening, was this story. There was a woman in my class named Trudy who was friendly and chatty. She was in her late 60s and had traveled all over the world and, like me, was interested in the paranormal and supernatural. So we quickly became friends and often distracted each other by telling stories when we should have been studying. One evening, after class, we went to a Mexican restaurant and she told me about a woman she knew who was a historian and university professor that had experienced an encounter with a vampire in the late 1960s. Trudy rarely told this story because she knew some people might think she was mishuga, which means crazy in Hebrew. But she knew I would get it. I absolutely do believe her friend's account, and I am happy that Trudy shared it with me. The woman's name was Rifka. In the spring of 1968, she was living in the apartment in Brooklyn, New York, where she had grown up as the youngest daughter of Hungarian Jewish parents. Rifka was 17 that spring and not particularly devout, which in her household was a condition you didn't announce but couldn't entirely be hidden. Her family had come from Hungary, from a village in the countryside near Debrecen in the east of the country, and they had brought with them everything that mattered: the language, the food, the prayers, the specific way her mother folded a napkin over the challah on Friday nights. Rivka loved her family without reservation, but wasn't that observant of rituals and traditions. She found herself far more interested in the world outside their apartment: the war in Vietnam, the student protests, and the general awareness that everyone had in 1968 that history was happening right in front of them are what had Rivka's attention, not the weekly observance of Shabbat and the approach of Shavuot, the spring holiday that commemorates the giving of the Torah at Sinai, and that her mother observed with flowers on the table and the apartment windows opened wide to let in the late May air. It was around the time of Shavuot that Rifka first saw him. She awoke abruptly one night and knew immediately that something in the room had changed. There was a quality to the darkness that was different from the black of night. It had a thickness to it, as though the air had become slightly more substantial than usual. At the foot of her bed, near the window, the overhanging shadow began to gather itself into the shape of a young man. He was handsome. This was the thing that most disturbed her years later when she recalled the events of that springtime. The fact that her first thought was that he was attractive. He was perhaps 20, with dark hair and a strong jaw, and he was dressed in clothes that seemed older than the decade, rougher in their cut, like something from an old-time photograph. Around his eyes, the skin was bruised and sunken, dark circles that went beyond tiredness into something else, something withered and sad that didn't belong on his otherwise young and beautiful face. Rifka could not move. She would describe it later as similar to the paralysis that comes in certain dreams when your mind wants to move but your body won't allow it. She lay there still while he crossed the room and sat on the edge of her bed, slowly, with a kind of deliberateness, as though he had all the time in the world, and she felt the mattress sink beneath his weight. Then he bent toward her neck. She woke to ordinary morning light. Her mother calling from the kitchen, the smell of coffee, the normalcy of a weekday in Brooklyn. She touched her neck and found 2 small marks just below her jaw, tender when she pressed them. She stood and went to the window and found the bouquet of lilies her mother had placed there just a day before, completely wilted, the petals dried and brown, as though they had been sitting in the vase for weeks. She told her mother nothing. What was there to say? She had had a bad dream. It wasn't the first time. The second night he came again, the same way, the same gathering of shadow, the same handsomely terrifying face. This time she noticed that he seemed to struggle at the threshold of her room, pausing near the doorway before entering, as though working against some resistance that she could not see. But he crossed it and came to her, and again she could not move. And in the morning, the marks on her neck throbbed, and the room smelled faintly of decrepit earth. The third night he came was the worst. By then her eyes had become to ache in the daylight, and she could not stand for more than a few minutes without needing to lie down. Several times throughout the day, Rifka noticed her mother looking at her without saying anything. That evening before bed, she sat down across from her mother at the kitchen table, burst into tears, and told her everything. Rifka had expected disbelief, for her mother to dismiss her or tell her that she was overtired and had an active imagination. What she did not expect was for her mother to go very still and to fold her hands on the table and to say quietly in Hungarian, "En tudom, hogy ki." I know who he is. Her mother's name was Noemi. She had grown up in a village outside Debrecen in the years before the war, in a community that was both Jewish and Hungarian and that understood the difference between its own supernatural traditions and those of its neighbors. She knew what a dibuk was, a dislocated human soul clinging to the living, spoken of in Kabbalistic traditions since the 16th century. The spirit of someone who has died with unfinished business and cannot rest. She knew what an estri was, the female vampire of Jewish folklore, a creature that flew by night with her hair unbound and fed on the blood of the living. These were Jewish matters, she said. This was not what was visiting Rifka. Noemi spoke to Rifka. Before the war, there was a boy in my village. His name was Andras. He was not Jewish. He was the son of a farmer whose fields bordered the edge of the village on the eastern side, and I had known him since childhood. He was dark-haired and serious, a year older than I was. Shortly after I turned 16, Andras and I started looking at each other differently, in a way that made us both feel warm and alive. As Noemi spoke, the expression on her face alternated between one of joyful remembrance and present preoccupation. I didn't tell my parents. I knew, without needing to be told, that this was not something my family would welcome. To be with Andras would be to go against centuries of culture and tradition. We lived alongside the Goyim, but did not mix with them. I was considering running away with him, but then Andras died. A fever hit him, ravaging his once healthy and robust body over the course of a single week, and then he was gone. The village grieved and then tried to move on, but then the livestock started to die. Goats and chickens were found in the morning drained of their blood. Then people began to report seeing him. Andrash, or something evil assuming his form, began appearing at windows and near doorways in the dark hours, with those awful shadows beneath his eyes. They called such a creature a vampire in the old dialect. The villagers were talking about opening the grave, but then the war began, and everything small and local was swallowed by the evil that was tearing through Europe. By the time the war was over and I had survived what I survived and made my way to America, most of the people from my village were gone, and nobody was thinking about vampires. But I believe you, Rifka. I believe every word. Rifka and Noemi cried and embraced each other. They went together to see the rabbi, a small elderly man in Williamsburg with a reputation, Noemi said, for knowing things that other rabbis preferred not to know. He was a student of Kabbalah in the old tradition, the kind of Kabbalistic scholarship that did not separate the spiritual from the very practical question of what you did when something was in your house that shouldn't be there. He listened to everything. He did not seem surprised by any of it. When they had finished, he looked at Rifka for a long moment over the top of his glasses and said that vampires, real ones, not the creatures of novels, were not unknown in the record of human experience, and that Noemi was correct. This was not a D-book. This was something from another tradition entirely. He said this in a tone of mild professional interest bordering on indifference, the way a doctor might describe a common diagnosis. Then he said something that Rifka found both comforting and slightly irritating, what she suspected was his intention. He said that a vampire of this kind fed on the spiritually weak, on those who were, in the language of Kabbalah, without the anchor of mitzvot, the commandments, the obligations and practices that connected a Jewish soul to something higher than itself. He looked at Rifka when he said this, and she looked back at him steadily. And then he smiled and said that there were, of course, far larger monsters in the world, and she agreed with him on that without reservation, knowing what her parents and the rabbi had lived through only decades before. But then he said, Shavuot is coming. Light the candles, say the blessing, see what happens. Shavuot fell on a warm evening that year. Rivka stood in the kitchen beside her mother as the sun went down, and she watched her mother's hands moving with the practiced sureness of a woman who had done this 10,000 times, who had done this in a village in Hungary, and on a boat crossing an ocean, and in apartments in Brooklyn in years of poverty and years of prosperity. The candles were lit, they recited the blessing. That night, the shadow began to gather at the window. Not at the foot of the bed this time, but at the window, at the glass, just outside. Rivka opened her eyes and watched without any paralysis, without the cold weight pressing down on her limbs, and she saw his face through the glass clearly for the first time. Young and serious and sad, with those bruised and sunken eyes. And she understood, without being able to explain how she understood, that he could not come in, that he could not see her. And she knew that this would be the end of her troubles. And she prayed at that moment that he would find peace. Andrash hovered there for a moment longer and then evanesced into the ordinary darkness of a Brooklyn night, and she did not see him again. Rifka became a professor of history at a university on the East Coast where she taught, among other things, the history of Central Europe in the 20th century. Trudy told me that Rifka was a serious scholar, and she also kept Shabbat without fail and observed Pesach and the High Holy Days, not, Trudy was quick to clarify, out of fear or obligation, but with joy and respect for her people and her traditions. I've thought about this story many times over the years. The Jewish supernatural tradition is rich and very old, speaking of Debooks, Estries, Lilith, and the Golem. But what Rifka found was something else entirely, a dark and tortured soul that came from a culture and a people that were not her own. What stopped it was a candle and a blessing, and a mother who believed in the ways and traditions of her people. Whether this is a story about faith or simply about the ferocity of a mother's love, I leave that for you to decide. I hope you have enjoyed tonight's episode. If you happen to be viewing this on YouTube, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. And if you would like to share your own personal encounter with the undead, please contact me at thenightvisitorsvrs@gmail.com or share here in the comment section. Thank you for listening. A special thanks to composer Tim Kulig for our intro music, Haunted House. You can find The Night Visitors on your favorite podcast platform and thenightvisitors.com. You can also subscribe to our newsletter where you will receive each week's episode directly in your inbox, as well as articles on vampire lore and vampires in popular culture.